So, one of my favorite movies and musicals is My Fair Lady. It's a favorite just because I like sort of Cinderella pretty girl stories, and also it's a favorite because when Chris and I, my husband and I first started dating, one of the first big dates we had was to go into Chicago and see My Fair Lady. So lots of happy connected memories to this particular musical. But if you've seen it, particularly the Audrey Hepburn version, Eliza Doolittle starts off as a rather grubby street worker. She sells flowers on the London streets, and one evening she's standing outside the theater and selling her flowers, and this particular professor encounters her. His name is Henry Higgins, and he is instructor in language and pays particular attention to the sounds of language. And he says, he's bragging to his friend, he said, I can detect anyone anywhere within a block where they live in the London streets because of the way that they speak. And so he hears her trying to sell flowers, and he says, you're from this block or this place, and of course she is. And then he starts bragging about how he could turn a peasant into a queen just by teaching a better way of speaking. And this then plants an idea in Miss Eliza's mind, and the next day she shows up in his living room begging for or wanting English lessons. And he decides to take on this challenge of not just teaching her own language, but of trying to pass her off, this peasant girl, into a queen, or one who could associate with a queen. So he sets about doing this, and the very first thing that they do is to try to get her clean. And she says something like, but I've already had my bath this year. And they insist, of course, on cleaning her anyway. And there's this chaotic scene, if you've seen the movie, where she's screaming her head off and there's steam all over everywhere, and they hold her old clothes by the fingertips and dump them away. And the next morning, after they've cleaned her off, Henry Higgins can hardly recognize Miss Eliza. She's so clean. And I watch that, and I think about how it is amazing what a good cleaning can do, isn't it? It's amazing how much difference that can make. She was transformed, and everyone could see that she'd been beautiful all along. And as they got to know her, as she began to say, the rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain, and all of that, then they began to see her in all of this new light. But what also happens throughout the movie is that she who becomes cleaner and more beautiful, she actually also reveals that Henry Higgins, who seems very clean and well-mannered and well-dressed, is not so clean on the inside, right? He's rude and he's mean, he's demanding, he doesn't see her as a person. He shows that inside he had quite a lot of cleaning to do as well. And sometimes this is the way that it goes, right? That our cleaning is not just on the outside, but on the inside as well. And this was part of the lesson for the disciples in the upper room that night in our story. They celebrated Passover together, Jesus and the disciples, for the very last time on earth. And one of the customs of this era is that when you gathered for dinner, you would wash the feet of your guests. It was a really important job because, the roads weren't paved, and they allowed animals all over the streets. And if you've ever been in a parade and had to walk behind the horses, you have an understanding of why, if you were wearing open-toed sandals as they had, you would need to have your feet clean before you entered a house, right? Particularly because they didn't sit with their feet neatly tucked under a table. They sat instead like reclining with their feet sticking out. And so if you've got your feet hanging out on the one side and somebody else sitting next to you, you really want to have those things clean, right? And so it was a very, very important job to clean off the feet of the guests. But It was also the job that absolutely no one wanted. No one wanted this job. It was the job that you gave to the lowliest of lowly servants. And if you, as a servant, happened to get this job, you knew that you had been in trouble that week, right? And you were at the bottom of the barrel if you were the foot washer. So understanding all of this then perhaps helps us to understand why everyone was so shocked, so appalled when Jesus said, I'm going to clean your feet. The other thing that you may need to know is that social ranking was really, really important in Roman culture. They spent a lot of time ranking and categorizing and putting a hierarchy to things and who was on top and who was on bottom. And Jesus wasn't on top from a wealth perspective. He didn't make a lot of money or any at all probably, since he wandered around preaching to people, but he was at the top of their particular social group because he was the teacher. They called him Lord, not with a capital L maybe, but Lord with a small l, because they respected him as the one who was their instructor. And then as they grew to know him, of course, they put the capital L, like God, for Lord. But even he was their teacher, and they respected him. And so he should have been at the top of the table order, the one who sat at the place of honor. And instead, he took the lowliest of lowly jobs that night. He didn't just help to serve, he washed their feet. And he told them that I'm not doing this just because no one else volunteered and I thought somebody ought to. No, he did it on purpose because he wanted to teach them something. He wanted to teach them that humility is important in leadership. Humility matters. Service is important. One of my favorite Bible commentators is Sally Lloyd Jones, and she wrote this about this particular passage. Jesus knew what the people needed most was to be clean on the inside. All the dirt on their feet was nothing compared to the sin inside their hearts. Now, if you haven't heard of Sally Lloyd Jones, it's probably because you haven't been reading children's Bibles. She wrote the Jesus Storybook Bible, and I know she's not really a scholarly commentator, but I really like that line from our kids' Bible because all the dirt on the outside was nothing compared to the inside. That is what Jesus noticed. The same thing that could be said of Professor Henry Higgins, that he had more dirt on him than Eliza did, is that we need to be clean, not just on the outside, but also on the inside. Humility is important. And humility, of course, is something that our world struggles with all the time, that you and I probably struggle with all the time. Now, here in the United States, in our non-kingly culture, we don't struggle with place settings or social hierarchy, right? We don't have a book of lords and ladies, then a listing of who's of better status. But, of course, we have a social pecking order all the same, don't we? Sometimes we pay 4 or 5 times the value of something just to have the right label. Do you know who made my glasses? Do you know who made my shoes? Do you know who made my purse? Walmart. But maybe you have something better, right? You might have a fancier label, and we do. Even Walmart tries to make their stuff look like the higher class things, don't they? Because social status matters. And it matters, as much as I hate to admit it, inside the church too. Sometimes it matters as we look at a bigger view and we look at the fancy churches on this side or that side of us and we think, gosh, I want to have a church like that. And sometimes it matters inside the church as we look at others and think, I want to have as much stuff as the person sitting next to me. Gosh, I'd like to pull into the parking lot with that kind of car, or I'd like to wear that kind of whatever in worship. And sometimes we make a spiritual status ladder. Maybe you don't do this, but sometimes we look at other people and we say, gosh, I wish I could pray like her, right? Or I wish I knew as much about the Bible as him. And then we think, well, at least I pray more than that guy, right? Or at least I know the Bible a little more than that person in my Sunday school class. And so we rank ourselves. And Jesus noticed this. Jesus noticed this tendency in our soul to rank ourselves based on stuff or spirituality or the ability to rule or the things that we know. And Jesus knew that these were deadly sins. They maybe didn't call them deadly sins then, but the Catholic Church got it right, that pride and envy and greed, those are deadly sins. They don't seem so bad, I just want a little bit better quality sunglasses, right? Just a little bit better golf club. But then it starts to work inside of you, and there's never, ever enough. Never, ever enough power, never, ever enough popularity, never, ever enough things to make us happy. And so they become deadly sins. And Jesus knew how to defeat them. You see, pride and envy, they're defeated by humility and servanthood. Not a showy servanthood that we sometimes see, leaders who go out for the photo op and hand out one bowl at the soup kitchen and then leave after the picture's taken, but real servanthood that says, I want the very best for you, and I'm not going to expect anything in return. That's the kind of thing that defeats those deadly sins. And Jesus washes the feet of the disciples without expecting anything in return. In spite of all the broken social standards, in spite of all of the disciples' protest, Jesus washes their feet. He extends grace. He demonstrates humility, and he tells them that they need to do the same. Jesus washed their feet in direct contrast to the religious and the political authorities that would soon send him to his death. You see, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, even Pilate, they were all full of status and posturing. And you might even argue that the reason they wanted Jesus executed was to increase their own social status. If he was out of the way, then the popular vote would be theirs, and they would once again have their status restored. And the world expected Jesus as teacher and Lord to act like them. But of course he didn't. He showed us that what really matters is loving others, extending grace, extending mercy. Popularity and social status, those are just heavy burdens. And they hang on you and they keep you from the life that is really life, because no one is ever popular enough. No one is ever famous enough. No one is ever rich enough. And if those are the things that we're striving for, then we're always doomed to be looking over our shoulder trying to keep ahead. Instead, the way to true happiness, the way to life abundant that Jesus promised us, is in humility and service. When we give to others, when we don't care about being the best, when we find out what others need, we give love and grace that we have already been given, and we find joy as we share joy. Jesus tells the disciples to wash the feet of others and to demonstrate humility and love in the same way. And when they do, it changed the world. They changed the world by serving and loving others. Now, demonstrating love can be hard when you stare into filth and dirtiness. It's hard sometimes to see past the ugliness or the dirtiness of a person who's worthy of God's love. It's hard with real dirt, and it's hard with metaphorical dirt, right? The pride and the selfishness and the greed, those are hard to see past as well. But seeing past the dirt is possible when we start with love. So one of my favorite stories that I think hits at this really well is from Christy, written by Catherine Marshall. I'm sorry, guys, it's two girly stories for examples today, but they're good ones, I think. So Christy is a story set in 1912 about a young 19-year-old girl who was raised in Asheville, North Carolina, by very wealthy, well-to-do parents. And she goes to a Christian mission center, Montreat, which is still around today, and she hears a Christian missionary speaking, and he invites people to come out to the Appalachian Mountains to teach school. And so she signs up, and she finds herself in this tiny little cove, and she starts teaching school. And when her students arrive, one of the things that she's overwhelmed with, there's many, many needs that she's overwhelmed with, but one of them is hygiene. She says, I couldn't get over how much my students smelled. You know, these students, they had large families, and they lived in tiny, tiny cabins, and they were of the philosophy that one only needed one bath a year if you were really trying to keep clean. And so her pupils, well, they had an odor to them. And in order to cope with this, she started bringing around a handkerchief, and she is embarrassed by her need to bring the handkerchief that's soaked with perfume around with her, and she wishes that her nose weren't so strong and sensitive. But as the year progresses, and this is why I'm telling you this story, she realizes that she needs the handkerchief less and less, and then finally not at all. And the smell of the children didn't really change. In fact, she says as the days got warmer, the smell got worse. But she says that she didn't need it anymore because she learned to love these children. She learned to love them and everything that came with them. And she learned to see them as they are. And somehow the smell then didn't matter quite as much. And I think that maybe this was what it was like for Jesus to visit us. For Jesus to leave the throne room of heaven in this sinless, perfect place and to come down into a stinky stable and to walk around with stinky people who have sin just dripping off of them, right? Selfishness and greed and pride stinking all the way up to heaven. But Jesus loved us. He loved us deeply and loves us still. He took on the lowest servant's job in order to show us that love is the thing that matters most. And so, as Jesus washes our own dirt off in the waters of baptism, we then are called to help others find that way of cleanliness. We are called to ministries that provide clean clothes and food and shelter for those who need it, to have real physical dirt washed off. But we're also called to have Jesus wash off our own dirt. That if we aren't serving with love, then we're not really serving as Jesus intended. The world is a smelly place, and those who wear around the dirt of pride and greed, they're nearly impossible to be around. But you see, Jesus taught us how to wash the dirt off, to take off the outer garments that hold you back, to take off the pride and the greed and the envy and the desires to be like others, and instead to take up that bowl of service. We serve others not for a spiritual reward, but for the gratitude of all that God has already done for us. This week, let us be challenged to love one another through acts of service. Let us love others just as Jesus loved us.